Welcome to Deuteronomy section 2, Preparing for the Future in the Promised Land. We stopped at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 29. So this week we'll take a look at the epilogue, which is 31 through 34. Deuteronomy, we find out, is modeled after ancient Near Eastern treaties. These mid-second millennial BCE treaties have provided an echo of a similar structure to the book of Deuteronomy. Especially significant have been the Hittite treaties from about 1400 BCE. They are in six-part structure, which is similar to the order of the topics that are in Deuteronomy. The suggested structure for this book came about as a result of an archaeological discovery of about 50 or 60 suzerainty vassal treaties that the ancient Near Eastern kings made with their subjects. You may remember that a few lessons ago we talked about the suzerainty and vassal treaties where the ruler would make an agreement with the people. He would provide things like protection, and they in turn would, of course, provide things like taxes and grains and so on. In chapter 31 of Deuteronomy, verse 10, we find that Moses is giving an instruction for life, which is what pretty much all of Deuteronomy is about, is reteaching and giving instruction for life. So in verse 10, Moses says, he gives them this command: at the end of every seventh year, the year of release, during the festival of shelters, you must read this book of instruction to all the people of Israel when they assemble before the Lord your God at the place he chooses. So this is basically chapters 4 through 28 of Deuteronomy that he is saying must be read in regular intervals. Call them together, he says, men, women, children, and the foreigners living in your towns, so that they may hear the book of instruction and learn to fear the Lord your God and carefully obey all the terms of these instructions. Do this so that your children who have not known these instructions will hear them and will learn to fear the Lord your God. Do this as long as you live in the land you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. So they are looking out across what's called the Transjordan area, and Moses is reminding them that they need to follow all the instructions in the book of the law, which is Deuteronomy. So for a period of time, we know the Deuteronomy text had been missing. So the end of, we're going to do a little history background here for the book of Deuteronomy. At the end of King Solomon's reign, which was 922 BCE, Israel got split up into two kingdoms. It was Israel in the north and Judea in the south. There were 10 tribes in the north, and the two tribes that made up Judea were Judah and Benjamin. So about 200 years later, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, and many people were displaced throughout the Assyrian Empire. So the Assyrians were some pretty bad dudes. And they dispersed people throughout their empire, which was pretty large. Some people, of course, fled away to the south, to Judea, and it's believed that the original script of Deuteronomy was brought with them. The style of writing was in the style of the northern kingdom priests, and in this way the book of the words was brought back into use again. Back in chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, Moses was giving instruction, and this is what he said about sacrifice. You must celebrate in the presence of the Lord with your God, with your sons and daughters and all your servants. And remember to include the Levites who live in your towns, for they will receive no allotment of land among you. Be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings just anywhere you like. You may do so only at the place the Lord will choose within one of your tribal territories. There you must offer your burnt offerings and do everything I command you. So from the beginning, there would be designated places for sacrificial offerings, and they would be chosen by the people who were the elders in each community. In 622, so we're going forward here from Solomon all the way up to 622 BCE. The king of Judea was a man named Josiah, and he had the temple of Jerusalem restored and cleaned. You can read about that in 2 Kings chapter 22. During the process of this cleaning, they discovered what was essentially the book of Deuteronomy chapters 4 through 28. After reading this, the king was mightily distressed and reformed the way sacrifice was done. So he heard the words of the book of Deuteronomy and was very distressed about what he read versus what was actually happening in the temple. In 2 Kings 22, it says, "And it came to pass when the king had heard the words of the book of the law that he rent his clothes." He was extremely upset. Recall that the temple had already been built in Jerusalem by King Solomon. So now King Josiah, who reigned from 640 to 609 BCE in the southern kingdom, designated the temple to be the central place for festivals, worship, and sacrifice. He also removed all elements that were present that had infiltrated from other cultural rituals. There were all kinds of pagan rituals that were being practiced within God's temple at this time, along with or beside and probably even instead of the Jewish rituals. Deuteronomy's introductory chapters 1 through 3 and the closing chapters 29 through 34 are believed to be an additional script due to the complete change of literary style. The use of the type of blessings and curses in this last section are of the style that was used by the Assyrians when they were conquering an area and making the people their vassals. But by 622 BCE, the Assyrians had already taken the northern Israel territory, and they were knocking on the door of Judea. So King Josiah was trying to warn people to believe God would protect them if they followed God's teachings and laws as prescribed in Deuteronomy, now that he has found and recovered the book of Deuteronomy. The king prescribed all animal sacrifice must be done in Jerusalem temple only. He nationalized the Passover celebrations and festivals so they would all be held in Jerusalem. You may recall how in the time of Jesus that he and his family, when he was young, would go to Jerusalem, to the temple for the Feast of Tabernacles and for the Passover. And so his family would travel to Jerusalem. And then at the end of Jesus's life, he is traveling to Jerusalem to participate in festivals. The ending theme for Deuteronomy can best be summed up in chapter 30. Today I have given you the choice between life and death, between blessings and curses. Now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice you make. Oh, that you would choose life, so that you and your descendants might live. You can make this choice by loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and committing yourself firmly to him. This is the key to your life. And if you love and obey the Lord, you will live long in the land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God's people are to love God as the Shema instructs. That's back in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And is based basically on the first commandment. And God's people are to love their neighbors, as the Decalogue spells out. All of the laws and instructions of the book of Deuteronomy are to be interpreted in light of these two emphases. There are many quotes from Deuteronomy throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament. There are many references or just responses to the words of Deuteronomy, as we will see just a few quotes here that are from Jesus himself when he was tempted by the devil after his baptism. And he uses words from Deuteronomy to dispel the devil. The words of Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, the second half of the verse say, he did it to teach you that people do not live by bread alone. Rather, we live by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So in Matthew chapter 4, you can read about the temptation of Jesus. So it's during this time the devil came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become loaves of bread. But Jesus answered, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So Jesus was hungry, and the devil is tempting him with the ability to turn stones into bread. The second temptation quotation is based on Deuteronomy 6, verse 16. You must not test the Lord your God as you did when you complained at Massa. Then the devil took Jesus to the holy city, Jerusalem, to the highest point of the temple and said, if you are the Son of God, jump off. For the scriptures say, he will order his angels to protect you, and they will hold you up with their hands, so you won't even hurt your foot on a stone. But Jesus responded, the scriptures also say, you must not test the Lord your God. In Deuteronomy 6:13, it says, you must fear the Lord your God and serve him. So then this third temptation of Jesus by the devil said, it reads, next the devil took him to the peak of a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. I will give you it all to you, he said, if you will kneel down and worship me. And Jesus replied, begone, Satan, for it's written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. So these are three specific references to Deuteronomy by Jesus our Lord. The impact of Deuteronomy is very great. It is quoted or alluded to almost 200 times just in the New Testament. It is also a major impact on the message of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets, especially in their condemnation of idolatry. I would like to share this video with you. It is a little bit of a foreshadowing of what is to come and an overview of the area of Canaan and the geography and the empires that influence Israel as they settle in the land of Canaan, which we'll be looking at in the books of Joshua and Judges in the future. But oftentimes during the course, we've been referring to different empires who came in and conquered the area or traversed through the area, making havoc. So this may help you with an overview, I hope, of some of those empires and how they came about.
His name and his deeds. That's pretty impressive, and I would say it certainly counts as some form of immortality. All right, at this point in Mesopotamian history, something really new occurs. And what happens is invaders from outside the region come in and take over for a while. And again, not only does the lack of internal barriers contribute to political instability in Mesopotamia, but there are all these easily traversed potential invasion routes into the area. So again, geography is determining what happens in history. The cities, which are located down in the Mesopotamian river plains, had always had a history of being kind of harassed and raided by incursions of nomadic hill tribesmen who would come down and attack the people who lived, the farmers who lived in the mudflats. Enkidu, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is a kind of a literary personification of these hill raiders. But the Babylonian period itself comes to an end when a major external empire shows up in Mesopotamia and, aided by that open geography, overruns almost the entirety of the region. These people were the Hittites. They are an Indo-European culture which had already established their own empire in what we call Anatolia. That would be the eastern part of modern Turkey. And they enjoyed a technological advantage in warfare. And the reason for that is they used horses and they harnessed those horses to war chariots. And up to this point, that seems to be a technology that had not been used in Mesopotamia. The high watermark of the Hittite Empire was from around 1500 down to about 1200 BC. And at the height of this point, they controlled not only all of Anatolia and most of Mesopotamia, but in fact the entire eastern coastline of the Mediterranean. Now, other than in the specific area of warfare, they don't contribute a whole lot that's really new to civilization. But instead, they're ones who copy and adopt a number of aspects of Mesopotamian culture, including the cuneiform system of writing, and then spread those cultures, those aspects of culture, throughout the region. The landscape of the ancient Near East facilitated not just the movement of armies, but merchants as well. And all throughout these periods, there is a lively trade and communication, not only among the Near Eastern kingdoms themselves, but even with states and peoples who are outside the region. So goods which are produced in Mesopotamia were bought and sold across the entire Mediterranean. And raw materials from as far away as modern Spain, Spain always had very important mines, were transported to the ancient Near East. Hittite power begins to ebb around 1200 BC. And following them, there's a sort of power vacuum. There's several centuries which are confused. There's really no single state or entity which establishes dominance over the region, and it really fragments up into a bunch of little miniature competing empires. And in this power vacuum, a number of minor kingdoms are able to establish themselves and flourish, which, while perhaps not important in terms of politics and political power, nevertheless, some of those make significant contributions really to all of world history in some other areas. And just two of these cultures that I want to mention here are the Phoenicians and the Hebrews. First of all, the Phoenicians are one of the first great merchant empires of antiquity. They create a coastal empire consisting of a string of port cities all along the eastern coast, and they were great sailors and seafarers and merchants. And so they would load their ships with goods from the east, carry them over to the west and sell them and go back and forth. And in the process of this, they ended up establishing Phoenician colonies in the western Mediterranean, as far away even as Spain. Now, one of these Phoenician colonies is the city of Carthage, which is founded on the coast of North Africa. And Carthage eventually will become the major rival to the growing Roman Empire. The Phoenicians are also very important to Western civilization because it's through them that many ideas from the ancient Near East get spread to the Western Mediterranean and eventually to Western Europe, and from there really throughout the world. So, for example, the written language of the Phoenicians was one that they basically stole or derived from Mesopotamian precedents. And then later, the Greeks come along and they take the Phoenician alphabet, and from there, we have the basis of many modern alphabets, including even our own. As for the Hebrews, by this point, they already have a long history of having a very distinctive religious and cultural heritage which goes back all the way to the 2nd millennium BC. But in that time of confusion following the decline of Hittite power, the Hebrews managed to establish two political states, Israel and Judah, both on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. Now, those states don't last that long, but what does persist with world-changing effects was the unique religion of the Jews, with its concept of one God. And of course, it's from Judaism that the two other great monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam, will both arise. I suppose it was inevitable that another major empire would eventually rise up to once again assert its control over the entire Near East. And when this new power emerged, it proved to be one of the mightiest militaristic states of all time, and it is the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians, who, like the Babylonians, are named after their capital city, in this case their capital city is Ashur, came to the fore in the ancient Near East around 900 BC. And whereas the Sumerians and the Babylonians are very heavily invested in cultural things, the Assyrians are all about war. They built one of the most sophisticated military machines yet seen, and they aggressively used it to conquer the entire area and to carve out a huge empire. The Assyrian army was very sophisticated for the ancient world. It employed a mixture of different types of troops. So they used chariots, but they also had archers, they had foot soldiers, they had cavalry. They even developed very effective techniques to capture walled cities by siege, and they stressed things such as order and determination in their campaigns, which tend to be hallmarks of modern militaries. Maybe most famously of all, though, the Assyrians ruled with a calculated policy of practicing terror, and they deliberately tried to instill fear in their enemies to intimidate them. Almost all of our surviving Assyrian inscriptions consist of stone pillars put up by Assyrian kings in which they describe the cruelties that they've inflicted on the people that they've conquered. And these are obviously intended, well, first of all, to discourage rebellion, but also to frighten their future opponents. For example, after subduing one uprising, one of the more famous Assyrian kings, a guy named Assur-Nisirpal, puts up a pillar outside the town of the defeated rebels. And on this pillar, he describes how he treated all those people who had fallen into his hands. He says, "I erected a pillar outside the rebels' city gate. All of the chiefs who had revolted against me, I flayed, and with their skins I covered the pillar. Some I walled up alive inside the pillar. Others I impaled on stakes on top of the pillar. And still others I impaled on stakes arranged all around the pillar. As for their subordinates, I cut off their skins and used them to decorate the walls." The most famous artworks of the Assyrians are stone reliefs that show the kings hunting lions. And these are graphic images in which you see lion after lion just riddled with dozens of arrows. If you go to the British Museum in London, they have an especially nice collection of these. And a common belief of the time was that if the king was a great hunter, then it means he would also be a mighty warrior. And so in their zeal to prove their fitness to rule as kings, the Assyrian kings spent a lot of their spare time hunting and killing lions. In fact, they were so enthusiastic about this that they seem to have actually hunted all the lions of the ancient Near East to extinction. And if you've ever wondered why there's no lions in the ancient Near East today, well, that's probably why. Once they'd killed all the lions, the kings then switched to hunting the next largest available animal, which turned out to be a sort of antelope. And there's reliefs of antelopes all stuck full of arrows. But quite honestly, killing a bunch of antelopes to prove your martial valor wasn't nearly as impressive as slaying lions. Every year, the Assyrian armies would march out to subjugate new area. But as time went on, they had to spend more and more of their effort putting down internal rebellions. As you might imagine, after hearing the sort of inscriptions they put up, the Assyrians were not exactly popular people. And eventually, a coalition of 12 conquered people joined together in a mass uprising against the Assyrians. And with this great rebellion, the Assyrian Empire came crashing down around 600 BC. The next city to rise to prominence in Mesopotamia was once again Babylon. And sometimes the resulting empire is called the Babylonian Renaissance, or the New Babylonian Empire. Just to be confusing, though, historians often refer to the same entity as the Chaldean Empire. So whichever name, it's the same thing. But Babylon now grows into what probably was the largest and the most architecturally sophisticated city anybody had yet seen. Babylon of this time was surrounded by gigantic walls, and ancient sources say that these walls were so wide that 2 chariots could drive side by side around their tops. Babylon of this time contained the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which were regarded as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And this was also the time of a huge but still somewhat mysterious structure which the Bible records as the Tower of Babel, but that was located in Babylon as well. Now, this was still Mesopotamia, so all of these architectural wonders, however impressive, were still made of mud bricks. But the inhabitants of Babylon found a way to make even mud look good. They discovered that you could coat those mud bricks with various glazes, and when you fired them, you could place pigments in them which would produce vivid, beautiful colors. And a terrific example of this technique survives in a section of the walls of Babylon which are called the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate itself consists of the gate and a stretch of about walls, it's about 50 feet high. And this whole thing is covered with beautiful, shining, bright blue mud bricks. And at intervals, there's these nice detailed golden reliefs of animals, including lions, bulls, and this sort of dragon-like mythical creature. It's a truly spectacular sort of monument. But if you want to see the Ishtar Gate, by the way, you have to go today to Germany, not Iraq, because German archaeologists stole the entire thing and rebuilt it in this giant warehouse in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. In addition to architecture, some other areas that the Chaldeans were particularly good at were mathematics and astronomy. But it's important to understand that their interest and achievements in those fields really represents the fruition of the long-standing Mesopotamian interest in ways to predict the future. In the last lecture, I stressed how the natural environment left the Mesopotamians with this kind of sense of pessimism or helplessness in the face of overwhelming and dangerous powers. Now, one way you might respond to that is you just accept it. But an alternate reaction is to believe that maybe, just maybe, you might be able to find some way to predict the future. And exactly this kind of quest for knowledge develops into a major component of Mesopotamian religion in the form of a belief in the power of various sorts of divination. Thus, even if the world is cruel and random and arbitrary, sometimes you at least might be able to see the bad stuff coming. One way that Mesopotamian priests decided that they could maybe predict the future was by a complex set of procedures and rituals and all this stuff, focusing on the examination of the internal organs of sacrificed animals. In particular, they believed the liver and the intestines, if you studied them, if they had any blemishes or abnormalities or had a funny shape or color, that you could use this to predict the future. And archaeologists have actually found clay livers covered with writing and symbols that were maybe used to train beginning or novice priests in how to read livers. A second area of divination focused on the night sky and the movements of the moon, stars, planets, and constellations. And what they were really practicing was what today we would call astrology. But to do it, they had to invent and develop astronomy and mathematics. And a lot of our basic principles of math and astronomy that we still use today were worked out by these ancient priests trying to predict the future. As with internal organs, the motions of the celestial bodies were viewed as containing information about the future. The key was you had to learn to read it properly. And they thought that the movements of the stars and planets exerted an influence over events. And so these motions were a method by which the gods kind of offered clues about the future. From at least around 750 BC, they kept a continuous and very careful account of nightly observation of the sky in Babylonia. And from at least the 5th century BC, the priests were casting horoscopes, just like you would read in the paper today. And their understanding of astronomy was so good that they could calculate exactly when things like eclipses might happen. In an environment where so much was unexplained, and where the forces of nature seem to be controlled by fickle gods, it's really not surprising that the Mesopotamians were desperate to bring a measure of predictability to their world. And the enormous intellectual effort they devoted to these methods of foretelling the future and the sophistication of the systems they developed are a testament, really, to the basic human desire to find order in chaos. After the Chaldeans, the next big empire of the Near East will be the Persians. But I'm going to wait to examine them until we've traveled around the world, really, looking at the other very first civilizations to emerge in several key regions. And we'll begin that process
All right, so in this portion of the video, we left off before we get to the Persians. And just wanted to point out one of the things about the Babylonians is that we still use, as he said, we still use a lot of things that the Babylonians learned about astronomy and mathematics. In particular, we use a system of time that's based on 60, and the Babylonian inhabitants who studied all of this used 60 as part of their math base. For example, we have 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and so on in an hour. We also have 360 degrees in a circle. And the other thing about the astronomy, as far as predictions and looking at the night skies, remember this is before the birth of Jesus. And so when the Magi are following the star to Bethlehem, this is part of the background for their belief that something great was happening, and it's incorporated into the birth narrative of Jesus. Very interesting, I think. This is a map. Well, before this was a map of some of the really, really early inhabitants from even prior to the point where Joshua and Moses are standing at the gateway of Canaan. So some of the very early inhabitants, and of course we see the influence of the Hittites here, here, here. And one of the other things I wanted to point out was the mountains. They call them mountains, and they are basically at the highest points about at 2,500 feet. So it's really not mountains in the, like we think about here as the Rocky Mountains or the Sierra Nevada. These mountains really are not a barrier for people coming through the area to conquer it. As the lecturer in the video said, there's easily traversed geographically, particularly along the coast. And so keep that in mind, that even though they talk about mountains, they're not high mountains with jagged peaks such as we have in the Western United States. And here's a political map. You can see some of the areas that Israel is facing. We're in looking at Moab, going into this area where the story of Balaam takes place with his donkey. And then we have the donkey story, you know, with Balaam, who is supposed to be cursing the Israelites. Balaam comes from way up here, so it's going to take him a while to get down here. We have the Philistines here. The city of Gaza was established by them, and it is still there today. And then this area is called the Gaza Strip. And we have Phoenicia, which the Phoenicians were the great traders of the area, who dispersed knowledge throughout the Mediterranean area that spread to the rest of the world. And so you can see also why this would have been easily a trade route, both on land and by sea. This week coming up, we have the celebration of the Jewish holiday of Purim. If you read the book of Esther, which is not really very long, but you can understand the story of Purim as being Queen Esther, who is able to save the Jewish population from complete extinction by the villainous character of Nahum. So I encourage you to read the book of Esther this week. It's a celebration by the Jewish people. They have fun, they have food, they have festival, they dress up in costumes. It's a great holiday, especially for children. So it's celebrated every year on the 14th of the Hebrew month of Adar, which is usually in late winter or early spring. This year, it is starting on Saturday night, March 23rd, and continues through Sunday, March 24th. If you are in Jerusalem, it goes through Monday. It commemorates the salvation of the Jewish people in the ancient Persian Empire from Haman's plot to destroy and kill and annihilate all of the Jews, young and old, infants and women, in a single day. Basically, he's declaring a Holocaust. It gets its name literally from lots, the word lots in ancient Persia. Purim was thus named after lots, since Haman had thrown lots to try and figure out which was the best day to carry out his plot to murder the Jews. And my joke for the week, since we're celebrating Purim and it's for fun for kids, how about we put on a camel wash? So suggested preparation for next week for the very last study of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Choose any text that you would like to discuss, and we'll delve into it during class time. Bring your devices, such as your iPhone or your phones or your tablets and your Bibles, and we'll do some research as we come across a topic. And if you would like, bring a snack to share with everyone at the class. Our ending verse of the day: do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? From 1 Corinthians 3:16. And the prayer: may we recognize ourselves and each other as temples of the Holy Spirit, worthy and meant to be cherished. With those thoughts, I leave you, and I hope you have a good week. And I look forward to next week, where we can explore and review our text that we've studied so far.